Naomi Carter rolled her small silver suitcase across the marble floor of JFK Airport. The wheels struck the surface in a steady rhythm, yet in the air there lingered another kind of silence, a silence woven of curiosity and suspicion. She was 35, her figure graceful in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her hair neatly tied back, her gaze serene. Nothing about Naomi suggested she was trying to boast. Yet nothing could deny that she carried a presence of her own, the quiet poise of someone who had walked through many wounds. In her hand, a first-class ticket for seat 2A glimmered under the lights, a seat that would make anyone smile with pride. But as Naomi drew closer to the boarding gate, eyes began to turn toward her, glances both fleeting and lingering. A middle-aged man adjusted his tie and gave a subtle nod toward his wife, as if whispering, "Her? In first class?" A young woman standing nearby looked at Naomi, then back at the simple leather bag in her hand, her lips curling into a half-smile. Naomi felt it all, yet her face did not change. In her heart, she had long grown accustomed to this silent judgment. People did not need words. Their eyes, the shift of their bodies, their strained smiles, all of it cut thin and quiet like blades. She found a place beside a tall pillar and drew in a deep breath. Outside, the announcements rang steadily, calling the flight to Los Angeles. But within Naomi, there was another sound, the measured, steady beat of her own heart. It reminded her that this journey was no ordinary one. Naomi was not just a passenger. Beneath her composed exterior, she was a federal inspector, carrying the responsibility of investigating allegations of racial discrimination in the airline industry. In recent months, she had read hundreds of reports, passengers of color denied upgrades, subjected to harsher checks, doubted even when holding valid tickets. Each line cut like a wound. And now, Naomi herself was stepping into the storm to witness it with her own eyes. Yet, before anything began, she allowed herself a brief pause, standing there, spine straight, eyes watching the stream of people flowing past. Children clutching teddy bears, business people rushing with laptops, couples whispering hand in hand. The world moved in countless forms, but a single skeptical look was enough to divide it sharply, who belonged and who did not. Naomi allowed herself a faint smile, not the smile of comfort, but the smile of one who knew she was about to step into a trial. A contest without any opening bell, fought instead with glances, attitudes, and the smallest decisions others would make about her. She adjusted her sleeve, gave a gentle pull to her suitcase, and walked toward Gate 23B. Each step echoed against the silence, and within that silence, Naomi told herself, "They may doubt my presence, but I know exactly why I am here." The waiting seats before Gate 23B were packed. People hunched over their phones and laptops, and a few children whimpered in their parents' arms. Overhead, the electronic board glowed. Flight 721, JFK to Los Angeles, boarding 0945. Naomi walked toward the check-in counter. Her hand gripped the boarding pass tightly, her steps measured and calm, as if she had rehearsed them. Yet she knew each step carried her closer to the threshold of a trial. Behind the desk stood a middle-aged white woman with blonde hair pinned high, sorting through papers. The nameplate on her chest read, "Linda Hayes." Her face was stiff, her eyes sharp as blades, sweeping across the passenger before her, before coming to rest on Naomi. "Ticket and ID," Linda said. Her tone held no friendliness, in stark contrast to the warm smile Naomi had just seen her offer to the white couple ahead. Naomi handed over her e-ticket and ID. Linda glanced at them. Then, instead of scanning them immediately as she had with the others, She frowned, holding the ticket up to the light, turning it this way and that. "This flight? First class, seat 2A?" Linda asked, her voice half doubtful, half mocking. Naomi gave a faint smile, her voice calm. "Yes, booked last week." Linda struck the keyboard hard, as though determined to uncover something wrong. The line behind began shifting forward, accompanied by a few muffled coughs and irritated looks at the delay. But Linda kept searching, longer than necessary. A young man in a blue suit standing directly behind Naomi with a business-class ticket in hand tilted his head, staring at her before smirking. He lowered his voice, yet deliberately loud enough for others around to hear. "There's always some problem. They usually do this." Naomi heard every word, but her face remained composed. She knew well the kind of people they implied. They, meaning people like her with dark skin. Linda finally looked up, a forced smile spreading across her face. "Please step aside while I recheck. It'll only take a moment." Naomi hesitated briefly, then nodded. She stepped aside, yielding the counter to the line behind her. What tightened her chest was the stark contrast. The white man directly after her flashed his ticket, and Linda immediately smiled, scanned it, and said, "Enjoy your flight. No questions, no scrutiny." Naomi stood there, her small suitcase by her side, her ID still not returned. From the waiting seats, a few eyes turned toward her, some tinged with pity, others with faint disdain. An elderly white woman whispered to her husband, "You see, they're always trying to push into places they don't belong." Each hushed word pierced like a needle through the armor Naomi wore. Still, she stood upright, her eyes steady. At last, Linda handed back the ticket and ID, her voice cold and flat. "Yes, your ticket is correct. You may go." Naomi took them, replying with a polite, "Thank you," before walking through the scanner. But in her heart, she knew this was only the opening shot. She had just passed through the first gate, yet the bitter taste of suspicion, of being seen as someone who did not belong here, lingered sharply. And Naomi understood. There were still many more doors ahead, any of which might slam shut at any moment, simply because she was a black woman. Naomi placed her small suitcase neatly into the overhead compartment. Seat 2A, by the window, cushioned in elegant cream-colored leather, appeared before her like a quiet refuge. She sat down, her breathing slowed, both hands resting on her lap. A part of her wanted to believe the turbulence was over. The murmurs around her caught her attention. The man across the aisle glanced at her, his eyes a mixture of curiosity and doubt. A young woman in a designer dress tilted her chin, murmuring just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Strange she's sitting here." Naomi did not reply. She quietly pulled the seat belt across her lap. At that moment, a familiar figure appeared at the cabin door, Linda Hayes, alongside a blonde chief flight attendant whose face was as cold as steel. They walked directly to row 2, their eyes fixed on Naomi. "Excuse me, Ms. Carter," Linda said curtly. "We've discovered a change in seating. Seat 2A has been reserved for another passenger. You'll need to move to economy class." The cabin seemed to freeze. A few sharp intakes of breath came from nearby passengers. Naomi looked straight at Linda, her voice calm, almost unnervingly so. "There must be some mistake. I booked this ticket last week and it was confirmed. This is a first-class ticket clearly marked 2A. She held out the boarding pass, her voice steady. The chief attendant stepped in, holding the passenger manifest. "We understand, but this seat was sold this morning to a priority customer. Unfortunately, you'll have to give it up." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. In her mind, she heard again the testimonies she had read. "They told me my ticket was fake. I was pushed down to economy without compensation." And now those very stories were happening to her. She asked, her voice slow but firm, "Please show me proof of this double booking. According to policy, The airline must notify the passenger in advance and offer compensation. You cannot remove a seated passenger. I want to speak to the duty manager." Linda smirked, her cheeks reddening as if stung by a fence. "You have two options, Ms. Carter. 1. Move to the economy. 2. Disembark and wait for the next flight. There is no third option." Naomi lifted her head, her eyes bright, not with anger, but with the light of someone who recognized injustice laid bare before her. She could feel the stares around her. Some lowered their eyes, avoiding her. Some smirked, almost eager to see her humiliated. Just then, a white man in a black suit with a Rolex glinting on his wrist appeared in the aisle. He looked directly at Naomi, then turned to Linda, his voice sharp with irritation. "This is my seat. I paid extra for 2A. Linda nodded immediately, her voice softening. "Yes, sir. We're resolving it now." Naomi looked at the man, then back at Linda. Her voice remained steady, but each word cut into the air. "So what you're saying is, I with a valid ticket am being removed simply because he arrived later?" No one answered. The chief attendant avoided her eyes. Linda pressed her lips tight, and the man folded his arms, his face showing impatience, as though Naomi's presence was an insult. For a moment, Naomi considered pulling out her federal ID, her true identity as an inspector. But she knew if she revealed herself too soon, she would lose the chance to observe how the system exposed itself. Naomi gave a faint nod. She stood, retrieving her luggage from the overhead bin. Her movements were slow, deliberate, not a sound wasted. To those watching, she was not a defeated woman, but someone choosing to preserve her dignity. As Naomi stepped out of first class, Linda exhaled with relief, and the man immediately dropped into 2A, opening his laptop as though what had just happened was a minor inconvenience. But for Naomi, each step down the narrow aisle toward the cramped seats in the back was a knife slicing at her pride. A white woman in row 3 leaned toward her companion and whispered, "See, I told you, not everyone belongs in first class." Naomi heard every word. She swallowed the pain, letting it settle like a smoldering scar. In her mind, one truth etched itself deep. "This is not just a mistake. This is living proof of what I came to uncover." And when Naomi lowered herself into seat 28B, wedged between a passenger tapping on a game and a woman burying her head in her handbag, she knew this story was only beginning. Naomi walked down the narrow aisle, pulling her small suitcase that now suddenly felt as heavy as stone. The rows of economy seats stretched endlessly, crowded with weary faces, shoulders drawn inward to make space. No one knew she had just been expelled from first class. Yet Naomi felt it sharply. Each step toward the back of the plane was like a parade of defeat. Her seat was 28B, the most unfortunate spot, the middle seat. A young man sat by the window, headphones on, fingers tapping non-stop at a noisy game on his phone. On the aisle seat, a middle-aged woman dug through her handbag, not sparing Naomi a glance. Naomi lowered her suitcase, leaned slightly, and asked to pass. Neither moved. The young man shifted just an inch, his eyes glued to the screen. The woman kept rummaging, forcing Naomi to twist and maneuver in the cramped space. At last, she sat down, shoulders pinned tight, her arms pressed firmly between theirs. The air was thick with the mingled smell of coffee and leftover fast food. Naomi exhaled softly, trying to steady her heartbeat. But each beat grew heavier within her. They had not only taken away her first-class seat, they had stolen the peace of every moment. Only minutes later, she witnessed the first scene. An elderly black woman sitting diagonally across the aisle raised her hand gently, calling to a flight attendant. Her voice was soft. "Excuse me, may I have a blanket, please?" The attendant, a brown-haired woman with a cold face, glanced briefly, then answered curtly, "Later." 10 minutes passed. The woman called again, this time her voice trembling. "Please, I'm very cold." The attendant strode past, lips tight without stopping. Naomi observed every detail, quietly opening her phone to take notes. She knew moments like these, seemingly small, were proof of the quiet favoritism at play. Then a white passenger seated beside the older woman raised his hand, speaking clearly. "Excuse me, she needs a blanket. She's very cold." Within seconds, the attendant returned, forcing a smile. "Oh, of course, I'll get one right away." A brand new blanket was delivered, quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. Naomi bit her lip. The scene was like a knife twisting into her heart. No words were needed. The disparity was plain. The same request, but only when spoken through white lips was it heard. Naomi typed into her notes. Disparity in response. Black passenger ignored twice. White passenger assisted instantly. Wedged between two strangers, Naomi felt herself suffocating. The young man to her left drummed along with his game, oblivious. The woman on her right rustled through her purse, her elbow pressing into Naomi again and again. Naomi sat motionless, like a stone caught between two opposing streams. She remembered Linda's eyes as she stood before seat 2A. Those eyes hadn't only said, "We need this seat for someone else." They had whispered something far crueler. "You don't deserve it." The plane trembled gently as it lifted into the air. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaled, reminding herself, this is work. This is a mission. She was here to witness, to record, to turn silence into words. When the beverage cart rolled by, Naomi witnessed another scene. The white man in the row ahead ordered a soda. He was served immediately, accompanied by a friendly smile. Meanwhile, a black teenager 2 rows behind asked for more water. The attendant replied curtly, "Wait a bit, I'm busy." 15 minutes later, the boy still had no water. Naomi watched him turn to his mother, disappointment written on his face. The mother forced a smile, patting his shoulder, but her eyes brimmed with sorrow. Naomi touched her phone again, typing a second note. Consistent delay for black passengers, white passengers prioritized. She was not merely a passenger enduring it all. She was a witness, a living record. Yet the tide of humiliation still rose within her. With every keystroke, her heart bled. How many times must black people accept this? How many times must black women remain silent beneath those disdainful eyes? Naomi lifted her gaze, staring toward the distant first-class cabin, the place she had occupied just minutes earlier. It was serene, spacious, now belonging to a man whose confidence came from the Rolex on his wrist. While she, who had paid no less, who carried justice in her jacket pocket, had been pushed down into this crowded place. A thought flared in her mind. They think they have diminished me, but in truth they have handed me living proof, and that proof will bring the whole system to its knees. Naomi closed her eyes softly, containing the pain. When she opened them again, her gaze was no longer one of mere endurance. It was the gaze of a woman preparing to turn humiliation into strength. Naomi tried to steady her breathing in the cramped seat of row 28. Each passing minute was a test of patience. To her left, the young man remained absorbed in his game, the blaring music pounding into her ears. To her right, the middle-aged woman shifted constantly, her elbow knocking into Naomi without a word of apology. She closed her eyes for a moment. In that brief darkness, Naomi reminded herself quietly, "Do not let humiliation turn into anger. You are here to witness. They may try to diminish you, but in doing so, they will expose the truth they want to hide." Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the front, pulling Naomi back into the present. The once noisy aisle fell silent. Passengers looked up, surprised. A man in a pilot's uniform appeared, Captain James Nolan. He was in his 50s, tall with straight shoulders. He did not wear the cold demeanor of an officer, but his eyes carried a hint of tension, as if searching for someone. Behind him was the chief attendant, Maria, small in stature, her face marked with worry. "Miss Carter?" The captain's voice was firm yet courteous. Naomi nodded slightly, setting down the pen in her hand. "May we speak with you for a moment?" The entire economy cabin stirred. All eyes immediately turned toward Naomi, the black woman in the middle seat, suddenly called by name by the captain himself. Naomi rose slowly, easing past the two passengers beside her. The elderly black woman who had asked for a blanket earlier looked at her, eyes filled with quiet solidarity. The captain led Naomi forward, stopping at the galley just behind first class, where a curtain shielded them from view. Maria pulled it shut, creating a small private space. James Nolan drew in a deep breath, then spoke in a low voice. "I understand you had trouble with your seat. On behalf of the airline, I apologize. This was not the proper procedure. Normally, if there is double booking, we resolve it at the gate, never by asking a seated passenger to vacate." Naomi kept her expression calm, though her heart pounded. The captain's words were the missing piece she had been waiting for. Confirmation that Linda's actions were not a technical error, but a breach of protocol. Maria interjected gently. "At present, we do have a seat open in first class, 5C. We'd very much like you to return there. We'll ensure you are taken care of properly." Naomi looked directly into James's eyes. "I only want to know one thing. Why was I chosen to leave my seat and not the other passenger?" The captain faltered, his gaze drifting aside. Maria clasped her hands tightly, her voice hesitant. "To be honest, we are still looking into it. Perhaps it was pressure from the gate agent, but clearly there was an unjust bias involved." For a moment, Naomi wanted to reveal the truth, that she was a federal inspector, that everything had been recorded, but she restrained herself. She tried to keep watching, to let the system expose itself fully. She gave a faint smile, replying in a voice just loud enough to hear, "I will return to first class, but understand this. The humiliation cannot be erased by simply giving me another seat." James Nolan inclined his head, as though acknowledging that the fault lay deeper than mere procedure. Naomi returned to first class. Eyes followed her, some surprised, some annoyed, and others pretending not to notice. Seat 5C opened before her, spacious, comfortable. She sat down, fastening her belt. But instead of relief, Naomi felt a paradox rising within her. The seat was softer, the service finer, yet her dignity bore a wound carved deep. A young flight attendant approached, bowing slightly. "Ms. Carter, would you like some water? We apologize for the earlier incident." Naomi nodded softly, accepting the glass, her voice even. "Thank you, I'm fine." But when she lifted her gaze, her eyes had changed. They no longer held the look of a passive passenger. They were the eyes of a witness who knew. From this moment on, every word, every glance, every decision would become evidence of a greater truth. In the first-class cabin, passengers returned to their newspapers, laptops, and red wine. But Naomi sat upright, silent, like a small flame. She knew what had happened was only half the truth. The rest was sure to erupt. Naomi sat still in seat 5C, her hands clasped together on her lap. The first-class cabin was luxurious, far quieter than the crowded economy section. Yet for her, the silence weighed like stone. Everything looked perfect, the seats reclining nearly into beds, the crisp white linens, the attendants gliding smoothly down the aisle. But beneath the polished veneer, Naomi sensed something waiting to explode. She had just taken a sip of water when a piercing sound shattered the calm. The call button rang repeatedly from a row ahead. A disheveled man in a baggy t-shirt shot to his feet, his voice frantic. "Help! Someone help my wife! She can't breathe!" The once muted cabin splintered in shock. All the passengers turned at once. Naomi instantly unbuckled her belt and stood. The woman in seat 6D, his wife, was convulsing, her face flushed, then turning blue. Her lips swelled, her breath broke into gasps, her hand clawing at her throat. "She's allergic!" the husband screamed, his voice cracking with terror. "I told you she has a nut allergy. Why was there residue in her meal?" Naomi rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside the woman. Memories of old first aid courses surged back. She babbled clearly. "We need an EpiPen. Does anyone have an EpiPen?" No one answered immediately. A few passengers glanced at one another, hesitating. Meanwhile, Chief Attendant Maria appeared, her face tense. "Please stay calm, sir. We'll call for medical support when we land." "Land?" the husband roared, his voice breaking. "She can't wait! She's dying right now in front of me!" Naomi looked Maria straight in the eye, her tone firm. "We don't have time. If we don't inject now, she will stop breathing." A middle-aged man 2 rows back suddenly stood. "I have an EpiPen in my bag. My son has allergies. I always carry one." He dug frantically through his backpack, pulling out the injector. Naomi took it with a steady hand, though her heart was racing. She turned to her husband. "You need to do this. Your wife will be stronger if she sees that it was you who saved her." He nodded rapidly, his hands trembling. Naomi placed his fingers on the pen, giving brief instructions. "Strike hard into her thigh. Hold it for a few seconds now." He squeezed his eyes shut and did it. A sharp click rang out. Moments later, the woman's breathing eased, her chest rising more evenly. A collective sigh rippled through the cabin. The husband cradled his wife, tears streaming down his face. His voice broke. "Thank you. Oh God, thank you." Naomi sat back, her hands shaking faintly. Never had the line between life and death felt so thin. But relief was quickly replaced by anger as she heard the whispers around her. Didn't she warn them about her allergy? Why didn't the attendants pay attention? They just ignored it until it was almost too late. Naomi's eyes met Maria's. Shame was written clearly across the chief attendant's face. Yet moments later, Maria turned away, as if trying to hide it. Naomi picked up her phone, opened her notes app, and typed swiftly. "Allergic reaction ignored." The passenger pressed the call button multiple times, but there was no response. Crew delayed, nearly fatal. The plane's engines droned steadily. But Naomi heard another sound, the sound of truth breaking through. This flight was no longer just about a seating issue. It had revealed deadly negligence and a silent discrimination. Who was heard and who was ignored? The woman had revived, now leaning against her husband's shoulder. He turned toward the attendants, his eyes red, his voice trembling with fury. "You left us to die nearly. If a passenger hadn't stepped in, my wife would be dead right now. You didn't listen when I begged for help. You only listened when you realized. You might be held accountable." No one replied. A few passengers nodded grimly, their eyes heavy with disapproval. Naomi quietly returned to her seat, her heart pounding like a drum. She knew now. This had gone far beyond a minor incident. This flight had become a mirror held up to an entire system. And she knew too. The real storm had only just begun. First class gradually settled after the chaos. The woman who had narrowly escaped death now lay resting against her husband's shoulder, her eyes closed, but her breathing steady. Chief Attendant Maria returned to the service counter, her face pale. The remaining passengers buried themselves in books, headphones, or laptops, as if eager to erase the memory of what had just happened. But Naomi could not forget. Her heart still pounded fast, reminding her that negligence had nearly claimed a life. And she knew it was not merely carelessness. It belonged to the same pattern as the scrutinizing stares, the silent dismissals, and her removal from seat 2A. As Naomi leaned back, a figure appeared beside her. It was Maria, no longer carrying the hardness of a chief attendant, but with reddened eyes and trembling hands clutching a small tray of tea. "Miss Carter," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. "I need to tell you something." Naomi looked up, nodding slightly, her gaze calm yet profound. Maria lowered her head, her voice breaking. "The issue with your seat earlier, it wasn't a mistake. The gate agent, Linda Hayes, told me your ticket might be fake. That people like you rarely sit in first class legitimately." Naomi remained silent, letting Maria spill the truth. At that moment, Maria continued, her voice cracking. I followed her orders. I was afraid to disobey, afraid to cause trouble. I forced you out of your seat, even though I knew your boarding pass was perfectly valid. I did it only because of your skin color." Time seemed to freeze. Outside, the engines droned steadily, but inside, Naomi heard only the heavy weight of confession. She looked at Maria, a young woman with tear-filled eyes, shoulders trembling with regret. In her, Naomi saw both weakness and the faint light of a conscience not yet extinguished. Naomi responded, her voice gentle yet firm. "Thank you for your honesty. But you must understand, what you call following orders has left a deep wound for me, and so many like me. They have endured this again and again with no one believing them." Maria bit her lip, nodding rapidly. "I know. I regret it deeply. When I saw you pushed into the economy, my heart sank. But I stayed silent. When I saw that woman nearly die from her allergy, I couldn't bear it any more. I knew I had to speak." Naomi gently set her hand on the tea tray, her eyes locking on Maria's. "Silence is complicity, but the courage to speak, even late, can still redeem something. What will you do with this truth?" Maria hesitated, her lips trembling. "If necessary, I'll testify. I don't want to keep hiding it, but I'm afraid. Afraid of losing my job, of my colleagues turning against me." Naomi's voice deepened, each word cutting the air. "Some losses are small compared to losing your conscience. Remember that, Maria." In that moment, Maria's eyes lit with a different spark. No longer only fear, but the realization that she stood at a crossroads of conscience. Naomi sat back in her seat. Maria bowed slightly, set the tray on the small table, and then stepped away. Before pulling the curtain closed, she paused for a breath, whispering, "Thank you for listening, and I'm sorry." Naomi did not reply. She closed her eyes, letting the words echo within her. Not every apology could erase pain, but sometimes they were the seeds of change. Behind her eyelids, Naomi saw more clearly than ever. Truth had begun to crack through its false shell, and this quiet confession would become a vital link in the chain of days to come when justice would finally have to speak. The plane jolted lightly as its wheels scraped against the Los Angeles runway. The long grind of metal sounded like a reminder. This turbulent journey had reached its end, but Naomi knew her real journey was only beginning. As the cabin lights flicked on, passengers hurried to gather their belongings. A few glanced at Naomi, then turned away, as if desperate to bury what had happened deep in the shadows of memory. But Naomi was different. She would not forget, and she would not allow anyone else to forget either. The aircraft door opened, and Naomi strolled out of first class. At the exit, she caught sight of Caroline Shaw, the senior flight attendant, her face weary with fatigue. Their eyes met briefly before Caroline looked away, her shoulders trembling under an unseen weight. Naomi stopped, her voice calm yet piercing. "Mrs. Shaw, I want to ask you one question." Caroline froze, her hand tightening on the handle of her cabin bag. Yes?" Naomi's gaze was unflinching, her eyes cutting deep. "Why was I, holding a valid boarding pass, Asked to leave seat 2A, when company policy does not allow such a thing. Was it because you were following orders from Linda Hayes? Caroline's face drained of color. She glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. I only followed instructions. Linda said your ticket might be fraudulent. She told me to assist so it wouldn't cause trouble. Naomi nodded slowly, her tone measured. Trouble, or prejudice. I had all the proper documents. I wasn't a stowaway. Yet in some eyes the color of my skin was reason enough to decide I didn't belong there. Caroline swallowed hard, stumbling back half a step. I didn't mean it that way. Naomi cut her off, her voice suddenly ringing sharp, freezing Caroline in place. You need to understand something, Mrs. Shaw. I am not just another passenger. Naomi reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. She opened it, revealing a gleaming metal badge engraved with the words, United States Department of Transportation Federal Auditor. The air around them thickened. Caroline's eyes widened. She stepped back again, her lips trembling. You're... Naomi snapped the wallet shut, her gaze like a blade. I'm a federal inspector. I boarded this flight to investigate racial discrimination in aviation, and today you showed me everything I needed to see. Caroline exhaled sharply, her trembling hands gripping her luggage handle as words of excuse died in her throat. Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady, each word striking like a gavel. Linda Hayes may think that pushing a black woman out of first class is a small matter, but to me it is evidence, and to this country it is a truth that must be exposed. For a moment, Caroline looked as though she might collapse into tears. She stared at Naomi as though facing a judge delivering a verdict. But Naomi wasn't shouting, wasn't enraged. Her composure made her words weigh 1,000 times heavier. At the far end of the jet bridge, David Miller, Naomi's colleague, was waiting. He stepped forward, his eyes greeting her with quiet understanding. No words were needed. His slight nod said it all. Everything necessary had been recorded. Naomi turned back to Caroline, delivering her final words like a blade drawn clean. You may choose silence, or you may choose to cooperate, but whichever path you take, my report will be filed, and justice will come. Caroline said nothing. Only tears rolled down her cheeks, staining the crisp fabric of her uniform. Naomi and David walked away, leaving behind a flight crew struck dumb. No one dared utter again. You don't belong here. And inside Naomi the fire of justice burned brighter than ever. That afternoon, inside a glass tower in downtown Los Angeles, Naomi and David entered the 14th floor conference room of the airline's regional office. The atmosphere here was a world apart from the aircraft just hours earlier. Polished floors, spacious halls, glossy posters boasting world-class service and unmatched reliability. But to Naomi, every slogan rang hollow, like echoes in an empty shell. Inside, 2 regional managers awaited. Joseph Peterson, a silver-haired man with a commanding posture, but his eyes were clouded by unease. Beside him, Andrea Lee, a woman in her 40s dressed in a grey suit, her lips holding a strained smile that quivered slightly at the edges. Thank you, Miss Carter, Mr. Miller, for coming, Andrea began, her voice smooth with the polish of someone accustomed to handling crises. We understand there were some unfortunate incidents on this morning's flight. We'd like to hear directly from you. Naomi did not rush to answer. She set her leather case on the table, unfastened it, and drew out page after page of printed documents. Each rustle of paper echoed in the room like the ticking of a storm clock. When she finally lifted her gaze, her eyes were as cold as the glass walls around them. This was not an unfortunate incident. This was a chain of systemic actions, discriminatory and in direct violation of federal law. I was stripped of my rightful first-class seat, with no compensation, and no proper explanation. An elderly black passenger was ignored when he asked for a blanket until a white passenger intervened. A black child's request for water was delayed, and a woman nearly died from an allergic reaction because her call button was disregarded. The room tightened. Joseph twisted his pen, avoiding Naomi's stare. David leaned forward, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "We're not speaking about personal impressions. We've gathered records, witness statements from crew members, and testimony from passengers. This is evidence of a clear pattern of bias. It cannot be dismissed as a coincidence." Andrea forced another smile, her tone deliberately soft. "Of course, we deeply regret these occurrences, but sometimes the pressures of the job cause staff to mishandle things. These may have been isolated mistakes." Naomi cut her off, her words dropping like lead onto the table. "No, this is systemic. Gate agent Linda Hayes ordered me out of my seat under the claim that my ticket might be fraudulent, without any evidence except the color of my skin. I have a sworn statement from a flight attendant confirming this. And Ms. Hayes's personnel file already contains multiple complaints. Yet the company continued to keep her in position." Joseph's face paled. He seized the file Naomi had handed over and flipped through its pages, detailed notes, signed testimonies, and excerpts from internal policy on double booking, policies Linda had blatantly violated. Andrea swallowed, her voice dropping. "Then what do you intend to recommend?" David leaned forward, his words slow but weighted. "We will submit a report to the U.S. Department of Transportation. This report will recommend a formal investigation into systemic discrimination. The consequences may include financial penalties, mandatory retraining, and potential suspension of involved staff." A long silence followed. Joseph exhaled sharply, setting his pen down. We want to cooperate," he said hoarsely. "Gate agent Linda Hayes will be suspended immediately. We will review the entire crew from that flight. We only ask that the DO to consider the impact on public perception." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Public perception is not my concern. Justice is. When a black woman is humiliated in plain view of dozens of witnesses, that is not a small mishap. When passengers' lives are endangered because of indifference, that is not a small mishap. That is a system in need of scrutiny, at its roots." Andrea said nothing more, only bowed her head, her hand tightening around the file. Naomi closed the folder, her eyes unwavering. "We'll file the report within 24 hours, and let me be clear, this is not a threat. This is a duty." With that, she rose. David followed, leaving behind a room heavy with silence. As they stepped into the glass-lined corridor, the late afternoon sun washed over Naomi's face. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth sink in. A piece of the burden had been laid down, but she knew the path ahead was still long before the system would be held to account. That afternoon, the sky had barely dimmed before the aviation industry was set ablaze. 3 weeks after the incident, headlines blared across America. American Airlines fined $2 million for racial discrimination. Clips filmed by passengers from that very flight flooded social media. Naomi being forced out of her seat, the allergic woman nearly dying, the chaos, and the hollow apology that followed. On the evening news, a spokesperson for the U.S. Department of Transportation read in a clipped, deliberate tone, "Airlines are obligated to treat every passenger equally, regardless of skin color or background. Violations will be dealt with severely." Linda Hayes, the gate agent who had set the chain of events in motion, was terminated immediately. Caroline Shaw, the senior flight attendant who obeyed the order without question, was disciplined and reassigned. Maria, the one who had courageously come forward with the truth, was granted protection and later promoted. Naomi read the reports alone in a small hotel room in Chicago, yellow lamplight softening her face. She gently closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair. There was no victory cheer, no fireworks. Only a faint smile touched with quiet composure. The next morning, she was back at O'Hare Airport. Same modest navy suit, same old silver suitcase. This time, her first-class ticket bore it clearly, seat 3A. She handed it to the young white agent at the counter. The woman glanced at it, then looked up with a warm smile. "Wishing you a pleasant flight, ma'am." No unnecessary questions. No suspicious glance. Naomi walked past the gate with a feeling she couldn't quite name. A mix of relief and tenderness that trembled inside her chest. When she settled into seat 3A, resting her head against the window, her eyes lingered on the endless blue outside. For a moment, she thought of all those who had been forced out of their seats, older people ignored, the thirsty children left waiting, and she whispered a vow to herself. "Every journey I take will not be just for me, but for all of them." The captain's voice came over the speaker, announcing takeoff. Naomi closed her eyes and exhaled deeply, not out of fatigue, but with the solemn knowledge that the road ahead was long. Yet today, at least, she had seen the first light breaking through the dark. As the plane surged into the sky, leaving the ground behind, Naomi murmured to herself, as if speaking to her own heart, and to everyone still watching. Every time a black woman stands up, she does not stand for herself alone. She stands for all who have ever been pushed to the back of the plane.